Hi, I'm Norman Lear, and I could not be prouder that the center at USC that bears my name is sponsoring tonight's event. I am now in I can't believe I'm saying this, my 100th year, and vividly recall the disturbances 50 years ago in cities across the country. That unrest led to a bipartisan commission on civil disorders known as the Kerner Commission. It called on Americans to renew their promise of justice and opportunity for all. 50 years later, I'm sorry to say that promise is still unfulfilled, but the need for it has never been greater. The successor to the Kerner Commission is called Healing Our Divided America. We are here tonight to ask, does entertainment play a part in that healing? I am convinced more than ever that it does. And now here to tell more about the need for what we're talking about, the man who founded and directs the Lear Center, my dear friend, Professor Marty Kaplan.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your amazing body of work. And thank you for the gift that you gave to the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism 23 years ago now that allowed us to start the Norman Lear Center. What's the Lear Center? It's all about the idea that stories matter. Stories matter because they can grab and hold your attention. And on that is founded the gazillion-dollar global content industry. Stories also matter because they show us who we are and who we want to be. They create culture. So storytellers have power. They have economic power, they have cultural power, and the storytelling industry has power. What the Lear Center asks is, you creative community, what are you going to do with your power? At the Lear Center, we have a program called Hollywood, Health, and Society, which is about informing and inspiring creators to wield their power responsibly. And that means sometimes dealing with difficult topics like the way the world is, and that includes systemic racism. Tonight, I want to thank the storytellers, the creative community in Hollywood, who are our partners in bringing tonight's amazing panel. The Writers Guild of America East and the Writers Guild of America West. Harvard Wood, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which asks, what is the cause of or reason you don't have a culture of health? Where does systemic racism play a role? The Mellon Foundation, which has given the Milton S. Eisenhower Foundation the resources to conduct the work that it's doing now. When Norman was trying to get All in the Family made in the 60s, America was burning, as he just said. Racism and inequality were tragic and high on everybody's minds. And Lyndon Johnson asked the Kerner Commission to look into it. And what they concluded was that the problem was not a lack of information. It was not a lack of analysis. It was a lack of will. So the question we're asking tonight is there a new will to heal our divided society? And Heal Our Divided Society is what the Kerner Commission's successor organization, funded by the Mellon Foundation at the Eisenhower Foundation, is all about. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our partner in tonight's event, the president and CEO of the Eisenhower Foundation, Alan Curtis.
Norman Lear is my hero, and over the years I engaged in many Archie meathead debates with my dad. Thank you to Marty, Kate, the Lear Center, Mellon Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and our distinguished moderator and panel tonight. Many of the members of the Kerner Commission were privileged white men, yet they concluded that the urban protests of the 1960s were caused by white racism. In Healing Our Divided Society, our 50-year update of the 1968 Kerner Commission, we in our National Advisory Panel concluded that America had made relatively little progress in reducing racial injustice, economic inequality, and poverty, and in many ways we have gone backwards. Since the Kerner Commission, public school segregation and mass incarceration of people of color have increased. Neo-Nazis have made their statements and inflicted deaths in Charlottesville. White supremacists invaded the Capitol building. Income inequality, wealth inequality, and deep poverty have increased. The pandemic has made things disproportionately worse for people of color and the truly disadvantaged. At the same time, we have learned a great deal about policy that works and policy that doesn't work over the last 50 years. What works is illustrated by vaccination, Keynesian investments in living wages, child tax credits, strengthened labor unions, Head Start preschool, equity in public school finance, community schools, proven housing mobility models that create residential and school integration, de-incarceration, and genuine partnerships between community organizations and the police. What doesn't work is illustrated by indifference to the unequal distribution of prosperity, by neoliberalism, by zero tolerance policing, and by false 1980s rhetoric on government being the problem. Yet since the Kerner Commission, America has not scaled up what works and has not scaled down what doesn't work. Part of the reason is that a significant number of Americans accept policy based on dogma and suppositions rather than policy based on evidence and science. We need a strategy for how to reverse that very unhealthy reality. But the overriding reason for lack of sustained progress in America in terms of not having new will, that is what the Kerner Commission said was necessary to move forward, new will. How then can we create new will today? Accordingly, for example, as we have spoken out on Kerner and healing around the nation, we have begun to ask how the performing arts and the visual arts can better create cultural change and new will to reduce racial injustice, economic inequality, and poverty. What has been our experience so far? Well, during our event, for example, with Poor People's Campaign, Bishop William Barber inspired us with how he uses the performing arts to communicate to diverse audiences of different races and economic classes. How can new will, we asked with him, be encouraged not only with audiences of the converted, but also with independents and with people opposed to Kerner priorities? Bishop Barber observed as well that the sanity of any movement is contingent on the strength of its song. He reminded us how important Aretha Franklin and Mahalia Jackson were to Dr. King. In our event with the Association of Performing Arts Professionals, Kennedy Center Vice President for Social Impact, Mark Bamuthi Joseph, set forth his ideas for inoculating, his words, dignity and empathy into American culture through upcoming Kennedy Center performances he is planning. All of these events are preliminary, and we now are asking how the entertainment industry potentially can complement the other arts in creating new will. It is easy enough to create a personal top 10 list of films, documentaries, and television programs that reinforce Kerner and healing priorities. My list includes A Raisin in the Sun, Do the Right Thing, Boys in the Hood, Selma, I Am Not Your Negro, 13th, The Hate You Give, Just Mercy, Riotsville, USA, and so many PBS miniseries. And I am confident that Kerner and healing relevant films and programs will continue to be produced. But that is not systemic change. As Franklin Leonard has written in the New York Times, a recent report by McKinsey and Company concluded that America's film industry is the country's least diverse business sector, and its systemic anti-Black biases cost at least $10 billion in annual revenue. It continues, Black content is undervalued, underdistributed, and underfunded. Black talent has been systematically shut out of creator, producer, director, and writer positions. Mr. Leonard concluded that getting Hollywood to make major commitments to improving society will continue to be an uphill battle. Just as NBC Olympic coverage ignored China's genocide of Muslim Uyghurs and Tibetans, and just as Hollywood has financially kowtowed to China and blacklisted Richard Gere, so I suggest the privileged white men who control entertainment have not done nearly enough to create new will for Kerner and healing priorities. In the spirit of Norman Lear, then, I challenge Dr. Cobb and our panel to complement visionaries in the other arts and to create with us a revitalized entertainment movement for new will and voter rights. We pledge to work with you and the Lear Center. As the Kerner Commission concluded way back in 1968, it is time to make good the promises of American democracy to all citizens, urban and rural, Black and white, Spanish surname, American Indian, and every minority group. Thank you, and I look forward to our panel tonight.
Thank you, Alan. I appreciate that. And we will, I hope, work together, pushing on forward on that agenda. So this is a rich terrain, and we are very fortunate that to explore it, we have the ideal guide. He is a writer for The New Yorker who writes about race, politics, history, and culture. He is a professor of journalism at Columbia. He is, I'm proud to say, the winner of the Walter Cronkite Award given by the USC Annenberg School in 2021 for work he did with Frontline about policing in Newark. And he's also the editor of the Essential Kerner Commission Report, which is just about to come out in a new edition. So I am thrilled he's able to be with us tonight. I'm excited to hear what he says. Please, thank you, Jelani Cobb.
Thank you, Marty, for that introduction. 54 years ago, next month, the National Commission on Civil Disorders, which is better known as the Kerner Commission, released its report on the sources of unrest in American cities in the summers of 1966 and 1967. Originally convened by Lyndon B. Johnson with the task of finding out what happened in these cities, why it happened, and how it could be prevented from happening again, the commission was expected to be a standard Washington blue panel investigation of a question that produces politically palatable responses, bureaucratic language that couch any real significant indictment or question or answer to the questions on the floor. Instead, in a gradual process of accretion, this 11-member panel, 9 of whom were white, 10 of whom were male, bipartisan, definitively moderate, marched down a path that culminated in producing one of the most stinging and noteworthy indictments of American racism of the 20th century. The report noted that policing, far from being the singular incident driving these uprisings, was simply the most visible context of a much broader set of institutional biases that produced a resounding and resilient inequality that defined the lives of Black Americans. Moreover, white America had conveniently chosen to absolve itself and forget the extent to which it was culpable in the creation of this state of affairs. That report was published just 3 weeks before Martin Luther King was assassinated, and dozens more American cities exploded into fire and violence. We revisited Kerner with a sickening regularity as we've witnessed that precisely the types of conflicts and the types of behaviors that led to the uprisings of the 1960s repeated in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and into the 2000s. One of the notable aspects of the Kerner Commission report was that it examined not simply the foundational institutions that you would anticipate, policing, education, healthcare, our employment system, but also did a thorough examination of the role of media in this state of affairs. And that's why I'm excited to have the really noteworthy panel that we have with us this evening to talk about this report 54 years later, what its implications are, and whether the entertainment is capable of forging a new will around these issues. We have with us this evening the writer-producer Kenya Barris, Tara Duncan, who is the president of Freeform, Elle Johnson, who is the writer and producer, and the founder of The Blacklist, Franklin Leonard. And of course, this is not even 1% of what all these people have done. You can see and examine their broader biographies in the chat. So welcome, everyone. I want to start with one immediate question, which is we're looking at the resurgence. This book over my shoulder, the Essential Kerner Commission Report, came about as a product of looking at the news in 2020 and seeing Kerner's recommendations flash in front of me all over again. Seeing something that looked like, I teach history, teach American history, something I kept saying, the feeling of having my syllabus jump off the page. And so I would like to start with the question of how each of you saw that moment in 2020 where we witnessed the death of Ahmaud Arbery, we witnessed the death of Breonna Taylor, and notably we saw that excruciating, almost 9-minute long video in which we witnessed the extinguishing of George Floyd's life. Can you take me back to that moment and how you all were thinking about this and how it translated into your particular vantage points in entertainment? And also, you're all in a different kind of array. So let's say we'll go with my screen. My screen is Tara, Elle, Franklin, Kenya. So we can go in that order to start, and then we'll reverse that order for the next one.
Sure, I'll dive in. So for me, 2020 was a bit unusual. I started the year still, I was building a production company, and I hadn't transitioned into work or into a corporate job yet. I will say when George Floyd was murdered, there was a certain type of exhaustion that I experienced that started in 2012 when Trayvon Martin was murdered. That was where a part of me just sort of broke and died, I have to say. And then after the events in 2016, there had just been somewhat of a malaise that by the time George Floyd was murdered, I was just really tired. And given how explicit the video was, it was, I was really just kind of down and perplexed as to where do we go from here. But then something happened. The protests broke out around the country, and the protests actually came directly to my front door, and I went out there, and it felt so good to be in the streets. It felt really good to see such a diverse group of young people banding together, demanding to be heard. And I walked away from that actually quite inspired. And not long after that, the opportunity to run Freeform came my way, and I was very much inspired by the young people that I saw taking to the street in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing. And so that for me, like, there was a direct correlation between that event and the energy and the perspective that I've taken into my role.
I'll just jump in off of what Tara is saying and say that I really was struck by just the global reaction to the protests and to the George Floyd killing, and realizing as I watched just all of these young people streaming into the streets that it felt like this was a different moment and that things could actually change versus it being business as usual just in this country, but that it really felt like this was a moment where the voices of this next generation who had been forced at home by COVID, disappointed that they couldn't be in school anymore, could not graduate, and had all of this energy and no place to put it, that this was an opportunity for them to kind of put their energy into something that I felt like they really felt like they could make a difference. And that made me feel like a difference could actually be made versus, you know, watching these killings happen time and time again and feeling like this is business as usual. It is not surprising. It's disheartening and disgusting and saddening, but it is not surprising, unfortunately. And how do we actually get out of this moment? And so it felt like the George Floyd protest felt, as his little girl said, you know, Daddy, you changed the world. And it really felt like that for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of the work that I do, I really feel like just, you know, in the last 2 years, having a sense of wanting to work on projects that go beyond entertainment. Yes, they should be entertaining, and yes, it's about getting people to watch something that's going to be, you know, enjoyable, but also for me needs to have a deeper purpose behind it. That really needs to be saying something that explores themes and topics that are personally you know, profound and that go beyond what we're used to seeing and kind of deal with a lot of what we're dealing with in our world now. So that kind of dovetailed with what was going on around me.
I think for me, you know, that was early in the pandemic, and I think like a lot of small business owners, right? Like I'm running a company of 7 people and like roughly 100 freelancers, and I was still trying to like get my bearings on keeping the lights on and making sure that everybody would still be employed, and was already sort of burning the candle at both ends in that direction. And I think, like Tara, I was just sort of exhausted and very angry and very sad. But it also confirmed for me something that I had believed for a very long time, and it sort of made me done acting like those things weren't true, right? It was very difficult for me to stop thinking about the movie Birth of a Nation during that period, you know, which is Hollywood's first blockbuster and gave rise to the Klan. It was very difficult for me to, and it's interesting, I didn't really reach that breaking point. I didn't really have that moment of being like, oh, this is where we're at, until Blackout Tuesday, if everybody remembers that, with the Instagram tiles and the sort of, you know, postage stamp styles, press releases from all of these companies. I remember seeing all of these things from the companies with which I've worked, and remembering all of the various moments that I had where, you know, maybe Black lives matter, but Black jobs and Black employees don't, and Black stories don't. And so I sort of reached a point at that point where I was like, I'm done. I know how this is going to go. In several weeks, several months, it's going to be business as usual. Those black tiles, if they're still on people's Instagram feeds at all, will have been long sort of lost in the feed. And nothing substantive is going to change. And sort of hilariously, the McKinsey study that was mentioned in the intro, it was really birthed in that moment. I got a phone call from a former colleague of mine at McKinsey saying that McKinsey was committing $200 million in pro bono consulting to racial inequity work, and specifically on Black economic inequity. And my response was, well, if you want to talk about Black economic inequity, there's a little bit of that going on in Hollywood. And not only is that bad in the context of Hollywood and people making money, but we're projecting the consequences of those failures 40 feet high on screens literally around the world, and it affects the material lives of Black people. And if people weren't going to believe B and Kenya and L and Tara when we went into rooms and said, hey, this is bad for people, but it's also bad for business, what you're doing, I was going to have to, tag somebody in that they'd be forced to listen to. And what better option than the people they actually hire to tell them how to run their businesses better? And the results of that was a study that found that, $10 billion a year are being lost as a result of anti-Black bias in the industry. And the most depressing thing, and I still don't exactly know how I feel about that, I'm not sure that people are clamoring that aggressively to claim that $10 billion a year, which, by the way, is the floor estimate for McKinsey. And that's just anti-Black bias. So when you think about women and other members of people of color, the disabled community, we're leaving hundreds of billions of dollars a year on the table just because the people that are running these countries.
Franklin, we lost your audio, I think.
That's strange.
Okay, so just because the people who are running these countries.
I said that we're losing hundreds of billions of dollars a year as an industry because the people that are running these companies and making the decision about what we make and how to distribute it aren't good at their jobs, which is making the best stuff for the largest audiences and getting it to those audiences. That 10 billion, that 10.
In my communities, we say you're telling too much truth.
It may be a failure of ethics. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
It may be a failure of ethics, this failure on diversity, but it's also a failure of business competence. And that for me is the sort of most critical element of this, is that all of these things are happening because the people that are running things could be running them better.
Kenya?
I remember that day, I had a lot of, I guess to start with, the feeling that I have was I had to fight the numbness that we've sort of been put into, you know what I'm saying? And that's sort of like, that's often like, I think for our communities, that's the hard thing to do, is like, we become numb to this. And to fight that numbness is sometimes a bigger struggle than you think it should be. You know what I'm saying? The idea of that, but it was so visceral and it was so in your face. And it was so like, it's almost, it harkened back to Emmett Till, and Chappelle told the great, story about a strong will, that Emmett's mother, which, subsequently leaving that casket open, saying changed the whole sort of civil rights movement, saying, because it was, at that moment, it wasn't about Black or white, it was about humanity, and the idea of like her strong will, saying like, you have to see this. And it just, the idea of like your humanity is being challenged. And so that moment for me made me fight my numbness, because we had seen so much. And it was really sort of a moment for me, because I had been unhappy, happy, whatever coincidence, but working with Ben Crump on a documentary, and which we actually had turned it from a scripted series to a documentary. And it was the sort of like, we had been hit so many things. It was a mod, it was just so many things. And the idea that we ended up being kind of front lines for that situation in a way that I was not expecting and did not have any idea of what it would actually turn into. And what it also did for me is, in the fighting of the numbness, is oftentimes, and I've told Franklin when I think about him with the blacklist, like, the idea of taking your power, you know what I'm saying? And like, sort of, sometimes you feel like you don't want to, you're almost embarrassed. I mean, if I remember for me, the idea of how the whole idea of Juneteenth and doing episodes and things like that came up, but was because my son walked into the room and I was watching some documentary about Columbus, and my son told me, he was like, Columbus never came to America. And I was like, I think you're mistaken, son. You know what I'm saying? And I looked it up and I was like, oh my God, you know what I'm saying? He actually did never come to America. And I'm like, beyond him being a horrible, a pirate and the tyranny that he did, we celebrate him, and we had a holiday for him. And I felt like I would laugh growing up at things like Kwanzaa and things like Juneteenth, things like that, because I was ashamed to make, truthfully, white people embarrassed talking about it, because I saw the embarrassment. And so it'd be like Kwanzaa, because we didn't, that moment for me, I felt like we're sort of, sometimes we don't want to make those around us uneasy, especially if you have and so you don't want to speak out. But I felt like it was the moment that I saw everyone come together in a way that I have not seen. And it was sad that life, that man had to give his life, in a way that, he became, I saw something really interesting that I remember something that Reverend Sharpton said, is that his life will be remembered and what he has done for this, for this country. And he had to give his life in a way that, had it not happened, he might've been a big guy from the projects who really didn't, make it or make us, but he gave his life. And I really feel like it was, if that man could give his life and his family, it could go through that. It's like, I have to do something and I can't let the numbness take me. And so it was at that moment, we were going through pandemic. We had this thing with Ben Crump. I was like, we put our own money in to go, and amazing filmmakers went on the front lines. We couldn't get insurance because, no insurance companies would cover us, but we were like, we had to be there. We had to tell these stories. And to, Franklin's point, it's so interesting that I love, Netflix has been very supportive, but the idea of having to put our own money up, having to go do this, whether it was ever going to be seen or not, they don't, I've always been told that the greenest, the Hollywood is the only story they really care about is green, right? This is, to Franklin's point and to the commission's point, it's not true. Like that is, we have seen at the most granular levels, they will fight against their own self-interest, even financially, to hold down stories, even if there is $10 billion at the floor level, I'm saying, they don't care. And so I have to you have to fight against that and say, why? And I think that what I saw and what, Ben Crump said he's told me in his documentary, is that the price of Black life has not equated enough to really count. You know what I'm saying? And I feel like, Ben said, the idea of what he wants to do is to set a record every time he goes out. And I'm like, well, why would you want to do it? He's like, because I want to make it, I can't bring the life back.
Right.
I'm saying I can't do this, but I can make it so expensive to kill Black people.
Yeah.
I'm saying that you may, and I kind of feel like that is such a harsh lesson to sort of have to hear. I'm saying, but I kind of feel like that is something that you really think matters. But when you start hearing Franklin talk about $10 billion, like, is there a price? Is there something so in the sort of seeds of this country and seeds of like how we're viewed in this world, that maybe it is something beyond, money and things like that. So I feel like that's the long-winded way of me saying that we have to continue to fight the numbness, because they want, I sometimes feel like if they throw enough at us, they'll feel like we won't, this one we won't, after we get our way on this one, we'll stop. But I think fighting the numbness was the big moment that I felt that day. And I, went to.
That's the pure kind of fatigue point that, people have talked, like Dr. King talked about that, Dr. Du Bois talked about that, that just the despair being the biggest ally, for people who want to continue the current state of affairs. I want to jump in and tell the audience really quickly that you can post your questions in the Q&A. You don't have to wait until the Q&A session. at the end of this. You can post your questions. We'll jump back with them as soon as we get a chance. I do want to ask one other thing, a kind of general question before I ask any particular questions. And we can start with Kenya and work backward. At the time, the Kerner Commission Report in 1968 talked about the overwhelming whiteness of media, and they were talking about the news media, but you could say the same thing about entertainment media. And we're now revisiting a lot of the same questions about policing, about education, about healthcare disparities and so on, especially in the pandemic. How much has entertainment changed in that time span? How different is the landscape now from the landscape that they were criticizing in 1968 for being overwhelmingly white? Overwhelmingly white, and from telling stories from an overwhelmingly white perspective.
I think it's, in some aspects there's been, massive changes. In some aspects there's not been any, but I think the thing that I've seen in my time, I'm saying in 20 years I've been writing, is that the focus of and the power behind what we can tell, I'm saying, is there is now sort of a fear that's been put, because I think, one of the things that the commission talked about was riots, I'm saying, and Dr. King talked about, riots are the voice of the voiceless, I'm saying, and the idea that, I probably shouldn't say this out loud, but I wanted to riot, I'm saying, and I know that's, I have children, and two of my daughters were arrested, I'm saying, during the time, and there was a moment where I felt I had to question myself, because I felt like really, the media was like, where they were talking, the idea of who was, so many of my friends my white friends called and wanted to give them permission to call, the looters, this, or call them this or whatever. And I'm like, I'm not going to give you permission. You know what I'm saying? And the media was looking for permission. And I felt, I questioned myself, because we have a little bit of something. And, I was like, well, it's good for my daughters to watch this, but I wasn't sure if I wanted them to go out to protest. And I was like, why? Why am I saying that? Because, because we, why is their life any more valuable or less valuable than anyone else's? And I felt like, what I saw and why I actually promoted them and made sure we went down to, to bail them out and do things like that, is that the idea of how the media will angle and skew things is who they paint as the protagonist, I'm saying, in a story, and who is, the opposition. I feel like they are, the thing I am seeing about youth culture is that they now have, in terms of where I saw it from the time the report has written, I think that now youth culture has a much bigger voice than ever before. I think than even since the Vietnam War. And I feel like in that aspect, there's been a lot of change, that the power of the internet, the power of social media can make someone who has a computer and if they have the right things to say, that can be it's a fearful, and powerful thing. And so I think that has been a big change that I've seen.
I'm gonna ask something really related to that. Franklin, do you see, Kenya talked about there being some things that are very different, some things that being, the same. Do you see in a distinction just in the time frame that you have been in your career, any changes in how people receive Black stories or the openness to it? Has this point that you've been making about $10 billion registered with folk, or are there any metrics of difference?
I think to the extent that it has, it's been not because the folks who have traditionally had power have woken up to the sort of new reality. It's because slowly but surely, extraordinarily talented people have been able to navigate their way into rooms and into powerful enough positions where they're able to make a unilateral, near unilateral call. I'm talking specifically about people like Tara, by the way, who, because she's there, because people like Tendo Ngenda and Nigel Kukendall are at Netflix, because Nicole Brown is at Columbia, like these are all people who are my generation. We are in our early 40s and late 30s, and we are in many ways the first to sort of reach these heights. So I think to the extent that there is more appetite for this sort of content, it's in large part because of the people who have managed to penetrate these rooms and make the business case for the value. But I actually don't think it's reasonable for us to judge the industry by the standard of 1965. I think the standard we have to judge the industry by is how it compares to other industries and how they've changed in America over the last 50 years. I think it is the most damning sort of statistic about Hollywood is that the least diverse business sector in American business. It is less diverse than finance. It is less diverse than oil and gas.
Wow.
It is less diverse than Donald Trump's cabinet was, numerically. And when you think about sort of that in the context of everything else, you know, I go back to this quote by that's often misattributed to Plato, but it's actually from like a 17th century poet named Andrew Fletcher. Let me write the songs of a nation, and who will may make the laws, right? And obviously, when he says songs, what he's talking about is the thing that is the lingua franca of culture and industry. It's not just songs. In our case, in 2022, it's movies and television. It's the stuff that most people consume. And it's not surprising to me that when you have the least diverse sector in American business writing the country's songs, and in so doing, writing the world's songs because of the nature of the way Hollywood exports these stories around the world, that you end up with a world that looks a lot like the world that we live in now. Because those are the stories that we continue to tell, because those are the people that continue to choose what stories are being told. I also, just going back to that McKinsey study for a second, and sort of a comment that Kenya made earlier about sort of the value of Black life and the value of Black stories, McKinsey put it in very clear terms. If you have a movie with a Black lead, you will get 24% less production budget on average. Right? If you have a movie with 2 or more Black off-screen principals, producer, director, writer, so a Black story, you will get 40% less of a budget. That's just for the budget. And then you'll get less on marketing and distribution as well, roughly 10 to 15% depending. Despite that, dollar for dollar, Black films make better ROI than so-called white films. We outperform in international territories, despite the fact that people assume you can't sell Black films abroad on average. And I only just noticed this now, perhaps because we're talking about it in a sort of historical context, but what we're really talking about is Black movies get 60% of what white movies get to make them, which is very ironically 3/5. And I know that makes me sound like a conspiracy theorist, but we're going to talk about the value of Black lives and Black stories. That rough 60% number seems to have echoes throughout history. And again, this is not me saying this. This is noted social justice warriors McKinsey and Company saying this.
I'm asked, not to jump in, John, but Franklin's. Do you think that we, as a community, are responsible or can be responsible for changing that narrative? You know what I'm saying? I think that so often we look outside. You know, one of the things I was looking for the report is that we're looking for outside contribution, where as a community, just within ourselves, we have seen, like Tyler Perry is a great example. You know what I'm saying? There is a huge amount of, you know, power within our community, but we're quick to sort of dislike, you know, the Image Awards. I would count myself one time because I was naming things that I, you know, won or whatever, things are, the Image Awards are like, oh, an Image Awards. And I feel like we sometimes don't value our own, you know, our own lives. You know what I'm saying? We sometimes let other people sort of put our value in our life in a different way. So I feel like it's amazing that you're saying that in the 3/5, you know, moment, but I do feel like the idea of like the coming together as a community. I feel like
if we're trying to have a voice in what's considered, you know, the mainstream media, we're still having to deal with the gatekeepers who are overwhelmingly white. And I'll just tell a personal story. I wrote a memoir called The Officer's Daughter that's about My cousin was murdered when I was 16 years old, and it's about kind of the repercussions within my Black law enforcement family and to myself. But initially, I wanted to pitch that as a television series. And so pre-Empire, so this was around 2012, I came up with a pitch to tell a story along the lines of the killing that would track this one murder within my family. And every place that I pitched it, in the room, to my face, said that there was no network that would buy a television show about a Black family. Could I change the family to a white family? And because this was about me and my family and my father, I said no, I was not interested in doing that. And that set me on a different path, which was writing this memoir. But this was a moment in television where no one would do a drama about a Black family. And then Empire came along and was successful. And suddenly everybody is looking to duplicate that. Now I count that as kind of a moment, not a movement, because I feel like now we're in a place where so many things have happened that people really understand in the industry that they can't make stories that are about people of color without involving people of color. And so now they're actively looking for those stories about people of color. But I feel like if we want to participate in the overall general scheme of the industry, we're going to have to get past those gatekeepers. And until we start, nurturing the Tara Duncans and the people like Tara who are going to get to the ranks of executives who will greenlight projects like this and let these projects come, until we're willing to pay our assistants and our support staff a living wage so that they can come from the ranks of people who are not trust fund babies, who are regular folk who don't need to make a living wage in order to get into this industry. Until we're willing and getting these industries to pay people that kind of wage, we're still going to have this issue of not getting our stories out there unless they give us permission to, unless they are saying, okay, we'll do it because it's expedient for us now when we see that the landscape is changing and we don't want egg on our face and we want people to listen to us because we want people to think that we are, with what's going on.
Elle, I think that point is really, really crucial. I came up in publishing in the era of the unpaid internship. And I remember Ta-Nehisi Coates and I went to Howard together. And I remember we would have these conversations about how you could look at every single major American magazine at any given month and not see a single Black writer in it. And it was the pipeline. Unless you could afford to take a completely unpaid internship, which eliminated 99% of Black writers, you weren't going to get into that pipeline. Tara, I wanted to know from your vantage point about the roadblocks, from your vantage point as an executive, about the roadblocks to telling Black stories.
Sure. I'm so curious, Elle, if you've sold that story now, like if you've been out pinching that, say I want it, but that definitely feels like something that would go around. The landscape has changed dramatically, not only from the 60s, but just in the last 5 years. I mean, in the span of just my career, these were issues that when I started out, I was, really reticent to speak about out loud. These were the things you only spoke with other execs or of color with, and it was for sure not something that you would, raise your hand about, or even, the idea of trying to make some change just felt very insurmountable. But now, there's just so many platforms. There's so much competition for audiences' attention, that and content now is on demand. We're not sort of at the behest of just programmers to watch what is, programmed at certain specific times. So in that regard, just the entire landscape has shifted. What hasn't changed and sorry, this is actually my first day in my office, and so I don't even know how to control the lights. They keep shutting off.
We've all been there.
Yeah, so as you can see, it's like, bare. What hasn't changed are the people who are in charge. And because of some of the choices that I've made in my career, it's very rare for me now to be in rooms where there are not people of color, but every now and then I do find myself in spaces where I'm still the only one. And those, you know, the higher you go, the less people of color you see. And that hasn't really changed. But I will say, I do think since George Floyd, just in the last couple of years, it does feel to me that there has been a shift. Not only just because of the social reckoning, but because of what we've talked about, which is just the money that's being left on the table. And the fact that there has been such a shift in our business and there is such a competition for the audience. And the audience includes, you know, not just sort of county A, if you will, but everyone. You know, companies are now really trying to focus on making sure they're appealing to everyone, and that there is that what they're programming has even global appeal, which is partially why, like, you know, I joined Disney to run Freeform, and like I said, was just really motivated and inspired to focus on a brand that serves Gen Z and millennials who are very much changing our culture overall. But within, you know, my first year and my time there, we were able to create the Onyx Collective, which is a new general entertainment brand for the company that is focused solely on artists of color. Now that came about partially because of the times I've been in many companies as the only one, really only wanting to focus on stories for my family, stories for people who look like me, stories about people who are a part of my community. And fortunately, now I actually have an opportunity to build a brand and create a space where, you know, there will be equitable budget levels. And you know, our brand is solely focused on making sure that not only is there a pipeline of talent coming in, but that you're going to see that reflected on what's actually made and what you see programmed on our streaming platforms.
And
So, I have a quick question that I wanted to follow up with you about, which is that you have, going back to the earlier point we were making, you have a law enforcement people in your family. And I wonder if you could talk about this from your perspective of being a Black person who also has family members who are in law enforcement, and secondarily, whether or not the way that we depict policing in media gives a honest or a skewed perspective on what that institution is and what it does.
Well, it's definitely, I mean, and I can only really speak for television. That's primarily where I work, but it's definitely a skewed perspective. I believe that it is definitely starting to change now, but you know, when I started in the typical kind of police procedural, you had the archetypal TV cop who is the lone wolf, who, you know, does the wrong thing, but for the right reason is able to break the law in service of, you know, getting some kind of greater justice that is not available through the system. And typically that person is a white man. I mean, that's generally who you're seeing depicted in terms of what law enforcement was, even though that is certainly not the reality in like places like LAPD, where there's a huge, you know, contingent of Black and Latino officers, even Asian officers. But I feel like television, because we are trying to tell stories about heroes and make you know, these people seem heroic, you get a skewed perspective on it. And so they're telling stories that are not telling the full story, and that are presenting behavior that is problematic, to say the least, as being the way to get things done. And that, as we're seeing now, you know, it's reflected in what's really happening out there on the streets, but it's not having the same repercussions on the television shows. So people are accepting the idea that a cop can break the law in order to get the right outcome, and that's totally justified. That actually makes that person heroic. And I think that's incredibly detrimental, obviously, to living in the real world. You know, you have these stereotypes or archetypes that are really harmful to what's going on. Coming from a Black law enforcement family, I feel like my perspective is more, I guess, layered, because I grew up with a father who was a parole officer, an uncle who was a homicide detective, and as Black men, they're very much aware of the racism that's baked into the system, and having to, on their own terms, kind of fight against that or work around that. And I think have more candid discussions about the reality of what it takes to do that job, but also being conflicted in terms of wanting to be able to correctly police your own communities, and that every community deserves to feel safe and taken care of, but that, you know, those things get twisted in the course of doing the job because people are not following the law, because people are feeling like they're above the law, and that creates certainly problems in communities of color where we're not given the same benefit as other communities. So I feel like part of the reason I ended up becoming a television writer is because I felt like I really understood that character, that world of the TV cop, or what it meant to be a cop. I felt like that was a world that I could write about. But I certainly also felt like I never really had a chance to explore all of the nuances that I saw growing up on many of the shows that I was writing for, even though I would definitely try to.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, when we could have a whole conversation about this, about the lessons we learned about policing and how we learned them. But I distinctly remember my father telling me, never let a police officer hand you anything. Never take anything from a police officer's hands. And I was like 10. And he was like, they just want to get your fingerprints on something so they can say that, was in your possession. This is a reality, that we still grapple with. And I don't know, there's some, I think, awareness of it, but I don't know that we have even grappled with the starkly different, relationship that these communities have to policing. Whereas I think in a lot of white communities, people see the police as the cure.
Right.
And I said for like a lot of Black communities, the policing are more like chemo, which is,
Right, it is.
Maybe it helps, but it creates its own host of side effects in its own right. I want to this quick question for Tara, and then Kenya, if you could jump in that order, which is actually, we'll go Tara, Kenya, Franklin, L. So I wondered what you all thought about the Amazon announcement about equity and inclusion in all of its content. I'm aware that we're having this this conversation in the context of the Rooney Rule blowing up, a week ago, 2 weeks ago in the NFL, about whether or not this has any chance of working, whether or not, I'm curious of what you all thought when you heard about this.
Yeah, I did see that announcement, and those their playbook is actually very similar to the inclusion standards that we adopted across Disney General Entertainment in 2020. I think they help. I think the truth is that by setting very specific standards and guidelines and making them a requirement, that's the only way we're really going to ensure that there is measurable change. This is still relatively new, so I think we still have to see how the next few years play out. But I will say, for the shows that I'm working on, and I literally had this conversation today, like, the standards are not optional. They have to be met. And so even though there are a lot of people of color working right now, then we have to find more. So I think it is very much a step in the right direction.
So Kenya, I want to ask that about Amazon. I also am curious about your vantage point on stories that people are willing to tell and the stories that they may not be willing to tell, as related to these kinds of issues.
So it's interesting because I just in having this conversation and just listening to people, I feel like these moments for me. So I'll answer the question, then I'll get to it. So the Amazon thing is really interesting. I don't know how, but somehow there's a lot of these things that I've been directly involved in. Like I said, the current thing. I believe that, being honest with you, I think that Coming to America changed, from what I understand, Amazon's whole marketing schematic. You know what I'm saying? The it came out, and in 24 hours, it performed more than I thought they thought it was going to perform in 28 days.
Wow.
And from my understanding, that Monday, they began to say, let's shift our whole marketing. This is going to be our sort of our voice, our narrative, and some things like that. So I do think that, and I was, lucky enough to be a part of that and see it, but I do think that, I think it's real, and but I do think it was driven by them looking for a voice, and all of a sudden, they saw it. I also was a part of that generation that came up under the UPN, WB, things like that. And I saw firsthand, one of my mentors, Felicia Henderson, actually wrote her thesis paper on this. The idea that the netlets and when you're looking for you're starting off, which is that we will show up for our stuff, right? And that those networks and things like that, if you want to get a certain amount of eyes, you can, because there's so few targeted programs for us. So if you can get this group of people, you'll get numbers, and you'll build your company up, or you'll build your network up, or you'll build your division up till you get the numbers. And then all of a sudden, slowly but surely, you'll shift into Gossip Girl.
Right.
You'll shift into that. And these shows and the people who are making them are left behind. And what it's all interesting to me. And it's been hard for me because I'm from Inglewood. I literally listen to Tara and Franklin, and they'll talk like it's not, I cannot keep up. What I can do is when I speak from my heart, and sometimes that's where I've been able to sort of like have some success. And I feel like just being honest, when I was speaking about us sort of, policing ourselves, and finding the $10 billion that was left on the thing. Why is that $10 billion we can't get? I feel like the idea of good, let them leave it there. Let's go get that. And the idea of like the notion, I agree with Elle when she was saying, but the notion of, I don't know if we can curse in this, but like, I feel like, fuck that. Like, I feel like fuck them. And I feel like the idea of I'm sitting with talking to a person who runs a network, runs it and running a studio. I'm sitting here talking to a person who has a list that says, if you're on my list, your script is probably, the idea, I'm sitting here talking to Elle who has the ability to, have a perspective that speaks to both sides and can, and as the idea that we have a power source and a power grid between us, that we don't need the other sources like we once did. And I kind of feel like I'm sort of at the point where I'm getting more and more frustrated by asking for our place at the table, when I feel like we really need to take our place at the table. And I'm not trying to say this in a sort of like a revolutionary way, but I do feel like we don't, and it's not like, but we have to.
Can I ask a question about that? So I went to Howard.
Yeah.
I grew up in these communities. We are like, our objective is to build our own. We have to build our own because these institutions were not made for us, et cetera, et cetera. But does that let them off the hook?
Who cares? Like it's.
Yes,
maybe, but I feel like in some aspects, if I'm being just speaking from my point of view, I feel like sometimes I think we become so worried with what they think or what they're getting let off the hook or this and them. And I feel like the notion of we have to, first of all, be honest enough to say like, this is good and this is not good. And just because this has us behind it, we don't have to just say like, we like it, but sports is a great example for us. I'm saying? Like you can say,
I want to speak to the sports analogy, actually.
I think that the idea that I can say without criticism, without feeling like my community turns on me, that I like this player over this player when they're both Black, because we've penetrated sports to a certain, but at a certain point, there's not enough of us in entertainment. So we can't criticize and we can't, do that. So we have to sort of support everything. And what I think that subsequently does is it doesn't set us up to have the highest patina in terms of when we're trying to do our stuff. But I think the notion of Nigel Kuykendall, who Franklin is to me arguably one of the best film executives in the world, Black, white, woman, man, whatever. And I feel like she is now in a power position, and we have enough, we can go get, we have enough people in the, we have you, Jelani, we can now go and, you know, you said you went to Howard, you're a professor at Columbia.
Yeah, I want to make sure I get Franklin in here, but I'm like very much interested in this Wakanda point that we have in here.
Well, yeah, I feel like I'm looking at these 5-star athletes now going to Black colleges.
Right.
Because they're now saying, we don't need to go. I'm going to go to the league anyway.
Here's what were you saying about this?
But what you're talking about,
I was saying that eventually this was going to turn into the spades table.
Yeah, I think we're about to get there.
Right.
So look, we're not talking about going to college to then get into the league. I think that would be true if it were, but the industry is not your college career, it's your NBA career. Mm-hmm. And so the question is not, do we start our own Black basketball league? It's, no, we're going to take over the NBA because we're better. Mm-hmm. And because there's no other league, right? The reality of the system of entertainment as it's sort of been grown in a capitalist environment is that it is a system that sort of protects the status quo. It is an oligopolistic organization that is highly capital intensive and requires legacy infrastructures, even in the world of the internet, to be able to broadcast content to literally billions of people around the world. So sure, the Black community could invest itself in building a new Netflix, but I actually think it's a lot more efficient and a lot more practical to take over access to the pipes that Netflix has out to the world. I think that the other reality, I want to go back.
Explain what you mean by that. I'm sorry, I want to follow you.
Let's say we wanted to build Wakanda film industry, and Black executives were going to say, you know what? We don't need their stuff anymore. We have all of the talent that's super in demand anyway, which is a pretty compelling argument, I think, when you look at sort of the best of everything, executives, filmmakers, whatever, right? Okay, so we pile a bunch of capital. Let's say we get a lot of capital, $10 billion a year to make all of those things. How are we going to put it out? Are we going to build? Are we going to take another?
Than ever, though.
Well, it isn't. It's not.
We're all consuming it from the same exact thing.
It isn't. It's not. But here's the thing: if it was easy to build a global distribution company, other people would have done it, right? It is. It requires a lot of capital. It requires engineers. It requires all this other stuff to build the infrastructure to then take the content that we will then make and distribute it. One of the frustrating things for me is that, yes, it is a lot easier now than it was 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago to make 5 years ago to make Black stories. But if those Black stories are not being marketed well because there's nobody in the marketing department who's Black, if there's nobody in the distribution side of the business that says, yo, we should probably be putting it in these theaters and not these theaters, if there's no one that can do that, we then are not able to capitalize on all of this, the good stuff that we're doing. And ironically, we're already delivering better ROI. So I think the thing for me is I'm far less interested in building another system than I am in literally taking over the system in the same way that we did the NBA, and pretty much any other sport that we pursue.
Well,
because right now,
on the player side,
take over the NBA. We're the lowest paid players. We're the lowest.
Hang on.
Okay. I'm the moderator.
No. I'm talking about access to the court right now. Eventually, you get to ownership, and those things are changing as well now too, slowly. My point is this: the industry, and I want to go back to Elle's point about the pipeline.
And I want to make sure, we are running up against our time, so I'll make sure we have time for Elle and Tara to respond to this. I really want to hear their vantage points.
Throughout the history of the industry, the positions that go to quote unquote talent have gone to people who have access to those opportunities, not because of merit, but because of financial ability to move to Hollywood and endure not making a lot of money, or social networks and access. Hollywood has basically been trying to staff a Lakers roster by only hiring the people known to ownership personally and the people they know. They are not going out into the world and trying to find the next Giannis, right? And that's what we should be doing as an industry that recognizes that the lifeblood of what we're doing is the talent that creates the things that we're doing. And the consequence of that is you have the least diverse industry in America, then broadcasting all those images around the world that then get recycled, contributing to the things that undervalue us as human beings, contribute to our undervaluation in every economic decision point that exists in our lives, and make it less likely that our kids can come to Hollywood because we can support them and give them a lease on a BMW while they're working as an assistant making $30,000 a year. So
Tara, I'm really, really interested in this and your perspective on this, particularly given your position, given the work that you're doing with Freeform, and given the conversation that we had last summer. We were just a kind of off the cuff discussion about the politics of telling Black stories in various media, and your forms and my forms and so on. And so what do you think about this?
Which part of it? Like, which part?
The viability of saying that we should be more self-sustaining, that the institutions are not likely to ever tell our stories appropriately or in the proportion that they exist in the world, and so on, and that this is really kind of part of this is about other kinds of mechanisms for getting these stories out.
I'm split between Kenya and Franklin's point of view. Like, there's a part of me, and I know the people on this panel, and you guys know me well, like, sound the horn, and I'm ready to, I'll go with everyone on the walkout. We'll build our own thing. Let's do it. I'm ready for it. I do think, though, to Franklin's point, Black audiences consume more content than any other group. Black women actually watch more television than anyone else. I think it's really that we have the infrastructure already in place, and especially at a company like Disney, the one that I'm in, we have such tremendous global reach that for us to be able to actually just take our due and to be able to build kind of like what is happening right now with Onyx Collective within the company, that is a much more efficient play. And to the sports analogy, it's like, not only is it's for us and it's by us, because we are also the biggest consumers, and we are also such a big driver of culture. I think the issue is just getting more people, more executives of color in power positions to be able to greenlight, to be able to be the filter of what is actually passing through that green light filter. So then, we're actually seeing the way that execs of color see the world represented in what's actually getting made.
Very quickly, this is why I actually think that the Amazon and similar sort of policies are not a solution, they're a cover. Because what you don't see in those policies is a statement about their own executive core. What you don't see in their policies is a statement about their budgets. What you don't see in their policies is a commitment to how they're spending their money to support the things that they're supposedly making with diverse teams. I personally don't care if a bunch of white dudes decide they want to make a TV show. I just want to make sure that it's just as likely that a bunch of Black women who want to do the same thing get exactly the same support when they show up with just as much merit as those white dudes do. Mm-hmm. And I also want artists, frankly, to have the freedom to make the things as they want to see them made. I just don't think that the companies that are deciding what gets made and by whom are doing a great job in solving the problem. And in many ways, these policies lay off the blame on the creators when it actually is with the system.
Oh.
Well, I mean, just to my point about being told that no network is going to make a story about a Black family, I feel like these places already have these rules in place. It's just to the other side. You have to have more, white characters than Black characters. And if you're going to have Black characters, let's make the Black character the lieutenant or the judge, thus skewing the idea that there are so many Black judges and lieutenants out there because it's a smaller role and you don't have to deal with that character as an actual character and personality. You just get to put FaceTime on it. So I feel like these rules, the Jim Crow rules of who gets to be cast already existed. It's just now forcing creators to think creatively and think and expand their thinking about what a Black character is and gets to do on screen. So I feel like I've already been forced to follow rules in some sense about who I get to put on the screen. So it's just a matter of, it's better for me because those are characters that I would like to tell the stories about. And I feel like that opens it up and forces other creators who are never thinking about the people of color and that the Black character doesn't actually go home with the white character for Christmas. They have their own goddamn family to go to. So for me, I feel like that is I can follow that rule gladly and willingly, because it just means that I get to tell more of the stories that I want to tell.
Is that a conversation that you're having with executives right now?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's for sure, executives now are definitely wanting to have more people of color, and they are more and more concerned with who is showing up on screen and that people are being represented. And, I can only guess that that has to do with the fact that by 2030, America is going to be a majority minority country, and everybody is worried about, making sure they're representing properly so that their stuff gets bought and that people are watching it.
I can say this from firsthand experience.
Okay, can you say like in 30 seconds? Because I want to make sure we get to the questions that people have submitted to the chat.
Yeah, it's gonna go away. You know what I'm saying? If we don't and that's why I'm not trying to be, look, I have been very gifted and paid very well by, white media. So, but I feel like if we keep the idea of like the moment and the idea of like people wanting to have representations like that, and they're really gonna really shout it out and say that's what it will go away if we don't find a way to control and I know that I agree.
But isn't the difference, Kenya, that now we can speak up? I mean, maybe I feel like now I've always had a big mouth, but now it's really hard to shut me up. Like if I say something that's wrong, I'm going to be able to say something about it and not fear that I'm going to have the repercussion of not being hired or being labeled as difficult because I'm saying what you're putting on screen is messed up and we need to do better. I feel like now the conversation is open and we can actually talk about it in a way that is not detrimental to our careers personally, where we can say something now. And if we continue to do that, if we continue to push that and be rigorous about it, then maybe we can keep this going. And as you're saying,
okay. I have to jump in. I have to bring in this question.
I will like one sentence. One sentence.
Okay, one sentence.
I want Black executives to succeed within the industry as it exists now, not just because I want better and more Black content, because I want better white content too.
So I was going to say, you could have like one sentence, not one of those James Baldwin sentences with like 5 subclauses and commas.
No. I'm just saying, I came to Hollywood not just to work on Black movies. I also love Wong Kar-wai and Ang Lee. And the fact of the matter is, I came to Hollywood because I want to make as much good film and television as humanly possible. And the only way we get there as a culture is by solving the problem of diversity. And it's notably also the fastest way we can make better stuff that has better business outcomes is to make sure that the people who are deciding what gets made and are making it actually look like the people who are consuming it, and they never have.
I will
say though that audiences though now
we're killing Jelani.
Has diverse casts performs better. Like I do think that there is just the audience is going to make sure that this isn't just a moment. And then we who are represented all the different facets of this business have to make sure that we are bringing people along with us so that as we move up the ranks that we're being replaced by people who share our same ethos and perspective on how to shift the business.
So I feel like we've had the most honest conversation possible in the absence of liquor, barbecue, and playing cards. But that said, I want to get into this question, which is, other than buying tickets and purchasing / streaming content created by Black and other underrepresented talent, how can we as consumers proactively make the case to the streamers, cable companies, traditional studios / networks, et cetera, that they need to increase investment in these creators' stories? What can consumers do? I think it boils down to
support. And I think that you support based upon your financial contribution, but also based upon your voice. And I think that is the thing that for me it is. Barry Jenkins is a friend. And so, but I think what he did with Underground Railroad was a piece of art. You know what I'm saying? Like, every frame, he was, in our own community, he got, shut down constantly. And it became looked at as, this is now trauma porn and things like that. And I feel like, well, then now we don't get any more, we can't tell the story because a group of people who I feel like that we have to support and also be able to have differences of opinion. And I feel like that, you know, the idea that it can't be just binary. You know what I'm saying?
Okay,
like,
I'm going to ask a question that's going to blow up the rest of this conversation.
right.
But I think it's important. I think we should grapple with it. We're talking about all of this in the context of a collective social trauma. For people, and I've been on the other side of this, I mean, I'm a person that teaches about lynching. I've had students that resisted me teaching about lynching because they felt that they were traumatized hearing about these narratives, particularly in a classroom full of white people. These are Black students who have felt this way. Is there a point? And, you know, I respect Barry Jenkins' work, you know, tremendously, as much as anybody, but do people have a point? If we're saying that we need to tell these stories, we need to be up, you know, front, we need to actually show like what our relationships are about. When we did our documentary on policing, I was clear that we were not going to show the George Floyd video. Like, even that was the start of it. We played the audio of it. It was a black screen. People heard the audio of what was happening, but we were not going to show that again. And I wonder if there is a boomerang effect that says that maybe in telling stories of Black trauma, it even further immunizes people against understanding or recognizing Black people's humanity. Why
do we have to have limits and
Right.
boundaries on numbers and things like that of what, you know, if it's a good piece of art and
Right.
why do you have to, like, why can there be as many Holocaust films, as many of this, why do we have to have a number, a limit? And I feel like
But there
That's
have
for
been,
the-
there
that's
have
for the
been
business
Jewish
people
writers,
to decide.
Dara Horn, as a matter of fact,
Yeah.
has this really interesting collection out, which is called People Love Dead Jews. And she made that exact point, where she said people have talked so much about the Holocaust that it has overshadowed the understanding of what Jewish culture is outside of the context of people killing them.
I mean, I feel like I agree with Kenya. If you're, as an artist, you have to tell the story that you as an artist feel you want to tell. Now, whether or not the business people are going to let you do that and you're going to get the money for it, that's another thing. And if you need to kowtow or couch it or, you know, change what you're doing in order to get a project made, then that's on you. But I feel like as an artist, if I'm compelled to tell a story a certain way, then I'm going to fight like hell to tell the story the way I want to tell it.
I completely
Sarah.
agree that that's your point. That's your prerogative as an artist, and you should absolutely fight to tell the stories you want to tell the way you want to tell them. I do have a slightly different perspective, though, because I think for Black people, as an audience, we are used to seeing our stories told in relation to white supremacy. We are used to our stories fitting in a box around trauma and slavery and struggle. And the truth is, we are so many other things. That is also a part of the experience, but it is not the full experience. And I would challenge artists to bring in stories that are more entertainment first and are about rallying people for things that are a bit more aspirational and more representative of the diversity of our experience instead of simply one simple facet of it, which is where I think most of our content has pretty much lied.
Not to keep beating this drum about the fact that the executive leadership is really where the problem is, but Black creators have been bringing stories like that to Hollywood's front door forever. And the problem is that the people who end up making the decision about what gets made, right, even if they are quote unquote allies, there is an inherent like, oh, we're going to make this story because it's important, right? So whether it's 12 Years a Slave or Selma or all these things that I think of as art, I fundamentally believe that artists should make art, but I promise you, if you had more Black people in the decision about what gets made, you'd have a bunch more movies and you wouldn't think that the Black trauma thing was so overwhelming because it wouldn't be such a high percentage of the content that gets financing from the industry, is sort of my convention. The other thing I would say is this. We all, like a lot of these stories are told in relation to Black suffering and not Black resistance. And I think the notable stat here is that there have been more movies made about Irish revolutionary movements than there have about Black revolutionary movements, despite the fact that I'm pretty sure there are more Black people in America than there are Irish folks, and the history of Black American revolutionary movements probably has more to do with the trajectory of American history and arguably global history than the Irish revolutionary movement. also
Could I say one
been
thing?
pretty solidly, consistently related, and those movements were obviously very well connected.
Can I say one
I
thing,
just-
Franklin? I think that here's a story that no one has made. I tell all my entertainment people whenever I have this conversation, I would be the first person in line to see a movie about the Christiana affair, which involves a group of Black people, free Black community in Philadelphia with arms defending escaped Black slaves from federal marshals who are trying to drag these people back into slavery. They shoot and kill these men. And Frederick Douglass shows up and takes the gun. Can you imagine? Like, we think of distinguished, great Frederick Douglass, but Frederick Douglass does the most hood thing, shows up and says, give me the gun.
We still haven't had a Frederick Douglass biopic. He was the most photographed American of the 19th century, and we didn't tell his story in the 20th century.
We have been given the hook. So this conversation is just really getting started at this point, but we're running out of time, and so we have to adhere. I apologize to everybody who submitted questions. Blame me. Do not hold this against Franklin, L, Tara, or Kenya. Just say that the moderator sucked. But I think that we had some conversations, some dialogues, some things that we needed to get to. And we, of course, want to thank the Norman Lear Center, and we are grateful, of course, for their support for this conversation. We have to wrap up. And is there anything I'm supposed to say before I wrap up? And I think we're at the point where I have to toss it back to Marty and say thank you.
Jelani, you did the right thing. And I'm sorry that everyone was shy and needed to be drawn out of their shells and finally figured out that they were at the spades table, and that barbecue and liquor is on the way. Thank you so much. Thrilled that you could be here. Truly exciting conversation. And I appreciate the Eisenhower Foundation for being the catalyst to make this happen. And I would like to say to the audience, even though you may not have gotten your question answered, please stay. A survey will pop up on the screen, and we would love to know what you think about tonight. Until the next time, thank you again, and lots of love from the Norman Lear Center and this amazing group.
Thank you, guys.
Take care, y'all.
Thank you.